The other 11 banks, as was pointed out later, were simply so much expensive window dressing. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York has always been the money center bank. The other banks have rubber-stamped whatever monetary proposals were advanced by the president of that bank, and he himself simply represented those 5 banks which held the controlling 53% of stock in that bank. Now, in 1984, I went to the chief administrator of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Joseph A. Coyne, in Washington. I just dropped in on him. I stopped at the Federal Reserve building. I said, I'm going to catch this guy. I had ordered from the Federal Reserve Board the original organizational certificates of each of the 12 Federal Reserve banks in 1914, which showed exactly which banks bought how much stock, and those banks exist today, and they own substantially the same amount of stock today. There have been mergers, there have been transfers, but because the Federal Reserve System was set up as a monopoly, they provided in the Federal Reserve Act that the stock could not be bought, sold, or traded. Therefore, you have never been able to buy a single share of stock in any Federal Reserve Bank, because there is not a stockbroker in the country who can obtain a share for you at any price. This has never been publicized. It's not known by the American people. We are given to understand, and congressmen have been queried by their constituents as to whether the Federal Reserve banks are government banks. The congressmen have usually replied, yes, indeed, they are government banks, when the fact is that the government has never owned a single share of stock in any Federal Reserve Bank. The 12 Federal Reserve banks each issued their own stock. That stock was subscribed to by banks in their district. There were 12 districts. And if that bank happened to go out of business later on, that stock had to be turned back into the Federal Reserve System. There was no way that you could buy a bank which had a voice in the operation of the Federal Reserve System and then give yourself an entree into the manipulation of our money and credit for the benefit of private stockholders. They set up a monopoly, and they have maintained that monopoly to this day, again without the knowledge and consent of the American people. When my book was published in 1952, there was no general knowledge of any of these facts. Ezra Pound told me, he said, these people have conspired to gain control of the money and the credit of the people of the United States. And that is exactly what they have done. But because over the intervening years, this book has been circulated widely, there have even been 3 plagiarized editions of it printed and sold in the last 25 years. And therefore today, almost any time that you pick up a paper, on the financial page you will see some reference to the Federal Reserve System. This was unheard of before 1950 or 1960. I read in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago that a Congressman Hamilton, had introduced a bill to rip away the veil of secrecy from the meetings of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And because he had introduced this bill, the chairman of that board, Alan Greenspan, had invited this congressman to lunch at the Marble Palace on Constitution Avenue, the Federal Reserve Board building. So congressmen are beginning to get into that building, which has been closed to them for many years. As I said, I walked into that building and I went up to see Joseph Coyne, and his secretary said, Mr. Coyne can only give you a couple of minutes because he has to go to a meeting. I said, that's quite all right. I just wanted to stop by and speak to him for a moment. So I went in, and he seemed a little uneasy, and I found out later that the Federal Reserve Board library a small monetary library for the Board of Governors downstairs, had every copy of the various editions of my books in that library, so they weren't missing any bets. So I asked Joseph Coyne about the voting rights of the various banks who held stock in the Federal Reserve banks. He said, "Let me assure you that even if a bank has only 2 shares, that they have the same voting rights as the Chase Bank, which has 15,000 shares." Now, anyone who believes that would believe in the tooth fairy from now on. So I didn't argue with him too much about that. And then I asked him, I said, you know, there must have been a lot of interest in those organizational certificates that I ordered from the board. He said, you know, since 1914, you're the first person who ever ordered those certificates. So I reprinted them, and I've circulated a few of them. But I didn't bring any with me this evening, but they are available, and they're quite interesting reading, because this puts you right in on the ground floor. Now let us ask, what has been the effect of the conspiracy of November 1910 and the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 by Congress? Well, the dollar of 1913 has exactly 1 cent of purchasing power in 1989. That is what the conspirators have done for us. I was in the Smithsonian Museum a few years ago, and they have a monetary exhibit which is quite interesting in the American History Building. And they had a very cursory exhibit of Federal Reserve notes. And there was one note, a $100,000 note, Federal Reserve, which had the picture of Woodrow Wilson himself on it. So I think anyone who had one of those notes would be very happy indeed. And that's the only one I've ever seen, is the one. They were in banks. Also, the early issues of the Federal Reserve notes, 1914 to 1920, are now commanding premium prices. A 1916 Federal Reserve banknote for $20 recently sold to a coin collector for $4,500. So there's been quite an inflation, not only in the purchasing power, but also in the value of the early Federal Reserve notes. Now, one of the things that people have asked me over the years is, what is the connection of the Internal Revenue Service with the Federal Reserve System? And that led me into some very interesting research. First of all, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 designates the Federal Reserve System as the fiscal agent of the entire United States government. Now, you know we have a Treasury Department, but the Act of 1913 superseded the Treasury Department and replaced it with the Federal Reserve System. And probably you don't know that all that money that you pay to the Internal Revenue Service never goes near any government agency. It is trucked directly to a Federal Reserve Bank. I was told that by Paul Desfosses, who himself had been an Internal Revenue Service agent for 23 years. And you recently had a Taxpayer Bill of Rights passed by the Congress. Paul Desfosses was interviewed by the Washington Post a couple of months ago, and he told his interviewer, he said that act is mere window dressing. He said it gives no protection whatsoever to the taxpayer. He said, furthermore, Congress does not expect any IRS agent to act according to the principles of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, because Congress needs more and more money for the billions of spendthrift and giveaway projects which they're engaged in and from which they get their graft and kickbacks, and therefore no congressman is going to support any help for the American people in the way of tax reform. In fact, the principal goal of every congressman in Washington, whether he wants to come out and say so or not, is to raise more taxes so that he can spend more money. Now, after the Federal Reserve System went into operation as the fiscal agent of the United States, they were authorized to print elastic currency. Paul Warburg had been publicizing for 10 years before he wrote the Federal Reserve Act. He had been publicizing the need for a more elastic currency. Now, what does elastic currency mean? Well, if you ever wrote a rubber check, you know what elastic currency is. Elastic currency is something you could stretch far beyond its original value and have it cover many more bills than it was ever intended to cover. So now that the Federal Reserve System was authorized to print as a bank of issue, that is a central bank, the definition of a central bank, which Thomas Jefferson inveighed against in 1793 when Alexander Hamilton wanted to set up the first bank of the United States, a central bank has the power to print money. A central bank also is owned and controlled by private stockholders. It may have a government name. It may call itself the Bank of England, the Bank of France, the Federal Reserve System, but it is a privately owned money monopoly which has a license to print money. If you do it, they call you a counterfeiter. If the Federal Reserve System does it, they call it a public service. It costs them a half a cent to print a $100 bill. And that money is issued against government bonds, which are also issued by the Federal Reserve System. Your government buys those bonds, gives the Federal Reserve System a bookkeeping entry of the full value, 1 billion, 10 billion, and begins to pay them interest on this book-created money. Then the dollar bills which you carry in your pocket are issued against those interest-bearing government bonds. Now, early on when I was working with Ezra Pound there at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, he said, well, you've got to learn the difference between interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing currency. Well, he might as well have been talking Greek. I hadn't the faintest idea what he meant. But I later found out that President Abraham Lincoln had issued greenback money during the Civil War because he rebelled against the 19% interest which was being charged him by the New York bankers on government loans to fight the Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln said, I have the constitutional authority to order the Treasury to print greenback notes, and he did so. And they were non-interest-bearing currency. So he was assassinated, and they went back to printing interest-bearing currency. In 1963, we had another president who said, I'm going to authorize the issuance of non-interest-bearing currency from the Treasury Department. And he did so, and he was assassinated in Dallas. And the next president, Lyndon B. Johnson, immediately rescinded the Treasury notes of 1963, and we went back to interest-bearing currency. So you see, it's pretty dangerous for a president to get into non-interest-bearing currency. We've lost a couple of presidents that way, and I think if anyone else tried it, we'd lose them too. But the immediate effect of the creation of the Internal Revenue Service was to sop up this enormous outpouring of paper money by the Federal Reserve System. This money was printed and it was issued in various forms to the people as wages, salaries, interest, so forth. But they had to constantly keep a tight control over it so that it wouldn't get out of hand, so that you would not have a runaway inflation such as you had in France during the Revolution, and you had the inflation of the continental currency after the American Revolution, and you had the inflation of the German mark in 1923 in Germany. So the function of the Internal Revenue Service, it's sort of like a garbage service to go around and sop up the excess money and keep the whole money-making system from getting out of hand. And that's what the Internal Revenue Service does.